This is going to be a session on security tips, tricks, and hacks in F&O. So some of this information is going to be things that you would need to know going in if you were setting up security. Some of it is going to be things that I have found or that other people I have found to kind of put together around features and functionality that you can use to help as you're going through and setting up your security. So again, just to reintroduce myself for those that weren't on my previous session with Andre, my name is Alex Meyer. I'm the director of AX and F&O development at FastPath. I have a Microsoft MVP in business apps. My contact information is there in the middle. A couple things I'll call out there are my blog and my security class that I have available. So um, I have a blog that I write on fairly frequently about things around licensing, security, anything audit and compliance related, things like that within F&O that I find in new features. And then the security class is just a combination of a lot of different topics, going from basically starting out in security all the way through advanced topics, how you would go through and set up your and configure your security. I've worked in AX and F&O for the last 5+ years, strictly around security on compliance functionality, and I've presented at numerous conferences and events before. So with that, we'll go ahead and just want to make sure. Okay, presenting in. And so an agenda for today, I kind of broke this up into a couple different areas. The first being around security reporting. What reports can we get from the system surrounding security? Where can we get information about how security set up, configure, things like that. Security setup, so how you'd actually go in and configure your security, the process for that. Segregation duties and mitigations. So what native pieces of F&O can we use to help set up our segregation duties and how we would actually document mitigations for that. User management. So, having a way to create, modify, and terminate users, and having a process built around that. And then some other just best practices in general around security. So I broke it out into these areas. So we'll go ahead and start with our security reporting. And so when we're talking about reporting, there's a couple different things that we want to keep in mind. The first is that we want to make sure we're regularly reviewing users and their access, right? So we want to make sure we're reviewing not only the users that are in our system, we want to make sure we're reviewing what roles they're assigned and the access that roles have, right? So one thing to keep in mind is that security is not a one-time process, right? You can't just set it up and forget it. It's something that you have to continually be doing reviews on because there are people are not static within your organization. Roles that people have are not static within your organization, right? And so if you're just doing a one-time exercise, you're going to miss out on a lot of different security changes that are occurring behind the scenes that you may not know about. And you really want to break this out into and review what tasks and business processes a user should be able to perform. If you're going in and trying to do an object level review of what a user and a role have access to, right, that's going to take a very large amount of time to perform and isn't going to probably be very accurate. And so what this idea here is that you want to actually look at what tasks a user can perform, what business processes they can perform, and kind of stick at that level when you're doing your reviews. You really want to make sure your reviews are being done by managers and business process owners. And if you were in the previous session that we did, we talked about the fact that a lot of times your security reviews, if they are being done, are normally in the realm of your IT sysadmins. And while that may seem like a good idea at the time, actually having your managers or business process owners do your reviews is going to give you a much better result, simply because your managers and business process owners within the system actually know what the user should have access to, know what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. Your IT sysadmin team doesn't really have that information or doesn't understand that type of process. And so being able to have your managers or business process owners review what access the user is assigned is really going to give you the best results for that. And then again, you want to take what we call a risk-based approach to your reviews. So again, you don't want to be going object by object in the system and trying to determine what a user has access to. You really want to take this idea of the risk-based approach, where you're going in and defining where risk exists within your organization, right? Where can this user actually potentially make a change that would put my company or organization at risk, and really do your reviews around those areas. And by doing that, you're going to limit the number of the amount of time or the amount of rows that users have to review, and therefore their reviews are going to be more accurate and they're going to take less time to complete, right? So by doing this, you're actually making that process easier to perform. All right. You want to also make sure, along with this, that you're minimizing administrator assignment, right? Or sysadmin assignment. You really don't want to try to be overutilizing the sysadmin access. Obviously, again, if you were in the previous session, we kind of covered this as well, but it's an easy way out, right? If you can't figure out what a user is supposed to have access to, or can't figure out what they need to have access to be able to perform a particular task, it's very easy to go in and just assign them sysadmin and saying, yep, now they can do what they need to do and go about your, the rest of your day. The problem with that, right, is you're introducing a whole lot of risk and potentially licensing costs that you don't need. And the other part to this is that it's very hard to undo. If you have assigned somebody sysadmin and then try to take it away, that's a much more labor-intensive task than just setting up their security correctly the first time, because then you have to roll back or undo and try to figure out what this user actually does while the system is live, instead of doing it during a implementation or setup phase. And like the point down below, obviously more sysadmins is going to equal more risk in your environment, right? Because a sysadmin can perform any task in the system, so therefore they automatically get access to perform all of the risk. That from a segregation duties perspective, it's going to cost potentially more money if a user only really needs a lower level license and you assign them sysadmin. The sysadmin license is a full operations level license, and so that's going to cost more money. And then again, it can increase the time for audit, because you're going in and your internal external audit team is going to ask for who's assigned sysadmin in your system, and then what are they doing with that access. So that's really the reasons why you want to try to minimize that sysadmin assignment for when you're going through and doing this. So there's the reports that you want to generate for this. If you are doing an internal external audit review, or just a best practice review, you do have the ability to go in and generate a user role assignment report, which then you could filter down to sysadmins and be able to give to your auditors to show, hey, these are the users assigned sysadmin. And that's under the SysAdministration inquiry, security, and user role assignments, right? So Microsoft does give you some out-of-the-box reporting for this to help with that process. And again, this is going to be, if you are doing or getting audited, either internal, external, it's one of the first reports auditors are going to ask for, because that's fairly standardized across any ERP or CRM system. All right. So moving into the security setup side. So when we're looking at security setup, you really have to look at, again, what are the pros and cons of using the out-of-the-box security from Microsoft, right? So in case anybody doesn't know, there are template roles, duties, and privileges delivered by Microsoft out of the box. And those are what become delivered with your system when you first go into an implementation. Obviously, if you utilize those out of the box roles, duties, and privileges, it's going to be fast and easy to implement. And potentially a pro or a con can be that those security layers will be automatically updated during Microsoft updates, right? So some companies view that as a pro, some companies view that as a con, depending on their level of what level of audit they require, I guess. If they're a very locked down or in a lockdown industry, if they have a lot of regulations, they don't want their security changing from update to update. Some companies would like to have that security updated so they don't have to worry about it, right? And worry about, trying to figure out what new security needs to be assigned for new updates from Microsoft. So the cons by using this are that your security can be over-provisioned. In fact, would probably be over-provisioned, simply because the security delivered by Microsoft at all the different levels, roles, duties, and privileges, are designed from a functional perspective, and don't really take into account segregation of duties at any point. So if you were to, for example, set up segregation duties and run that against the out-of-the-box security from Microsoft, right, you're going to find segregation duties conflicts even inherent within the rules themselves. So from a functional being designed from a functional perspective in this case means that Microsoft wants to give you access to as many features and functionality within a particular area, and aren't really concerned about segregating out those functions into separate roles of the system. And then again, talking about a con in this point, again, you can argue whether this is a pro or a con, but security layers getting automatically updated during the Microsoft update, right? Because if you're I listed it in both because it can be listed as a pro or a con. The fact that your security could potentially be changing between updates from Microsoft, and if you're not aware of that or don't understand the implications of that, right, that could be a con in this case. All right, so moving into looking at the different object types that exist. So I wanted to make sure that I did cover some, maybe, obviously if you're a sysadmin or been doing security before, right, this is going to be slightly review, but just wanted to make sure that everybody kind of understands it has a base level of what the different object types that exist within F&O are. So the first one that we're going to cover are menu items. Menu items have three different types or three different types that they can be. They can be menu item displays, menu item outputs, or menu item actions. So a menu item display is going to be tied to a form within the application. So anytime you're navigating and you come to a form, that form security is actually tied to a menu item, right? So there's no security at the form level, and there's form controls and things on the form, but the form itself, the security for that is controlled by the menu item. There's menu item outputs, which are anytime you have reports that users can run and export. So anytime that window pops up and asks how you want that report to run, the actual process for that or the security tied to that report is a menu item output. And then the final piece is a menu item action. So anytime you have a button or something within F&O that actually performs a task in the background, or calculates something, or basically anytime you have that perform that task, that's going to be a menu item action. So that's the first type of object, and with the change in security, or how the security model kind of changes within F&O, menu items are where you do most of your security setup within F&O. The next object is going to be tables. Tables actually refer to exactly what they sound like. They refer directly to SQL tables where the data is stored. There's also table fields that you can get down to underneath this, but for these purposes, I'm just going to list that at the table level. Both menu items and tables both have create, read, update, and delete permissions, right? So you can set up your security for those using your normal CRUD operations. The next piece or the next object type is going to be a data entity. So data entity is kind of a new concept within F&O, but it allows you to encapsulate or basically combine a business concept that may go across multiple tables. So an example of this would be something like system user, or another good, I'm trying to think of other good examples of those, but basically where behind the scenes the data for those could live across multiple tables, but Microsoft basically joins all those together for you and delivers a data entity that you can consume from an external service. So again, this allows for CRUD operations. You can kind of think of them as like a SQL view that you can actually interact with. If you're more of a technical person, you can actually do create, read, update, and delete against it. And again, this is one of the easier ways for external services, so anything outside of F&O, to actually interact with F&O data, because it delivers that data in a very user-friendly format. And then the final one is service operations. So these are actual API endpoints that you create in X++. And the only security you can place around this is the invoke permission. So you either basically have access to the endpoint or don't. And so that's kind of the the one outlier, I guess, from the other objects, right? All the other objects have create, read, update, and delete permissions around them, and then your service operations basically have the invoke permission. All right, and then along with the object types, you have the different access types and access levels. So this is one of where we start to get slightly one of the changes between AX 2012 and FNO, and we'll get into that at the access level perspective. But from a access type perspective, you have basically the same types of permissions you had within AX 2012, read, update, create, and delete, or what was full control within AX 2012. And these are used for menu items, tables, and data entities again, and those are hierarchy based, right? So that's going from least to greatest. As you work up the chain, you get more and more access to the object. Another thing to keep in mind with this is that you inherit, if you, because they're hierarchy based, if you assign access, you get all the access underneath it as well. So if you assign create permission to an object, you inherently get update and read behind the scenes as well. All right, so just something to keep in mind there. And then, like I mentioned, the invoke is the access type that exists for the service operation. So that's the one different object there. And then access levels are where we get into a slightly different scenario than AX 2012. With access levels, didn't really exist within AX 2012, right? You basically were either granting the object or you didn't. There wasn't any other access type or access level, excuse me. With FNO, you actually have three different access levels now. So for each access type, you can either have unset, grant, or deny. And so those three different states, the grant level is the easiest to explain, right? You either have access to that object at that access type level or you don't. That basically is the same as AX 2012. The other two are actually new within FNO. And so I'll explain the deny first. So that deny access level is actually an explicit deny, and that's going to override any other grants you have to that access to that object by any other role due to your privilege. So as an example, you could have full control to a particular object from role 1, but if you have role 2 that denies that permission, it's going to that deny is going to override that grant. And so that piece is new within FNO, and it allows for simplifying some of the security setup that had to be done within AX 2012. If you were trying to mimic this particular access, right, you would have to go to do things like role overrides and all sorts of different things to try to get this deny permission that didn't really exist within AX 2012. So the deny permission is something that makes security setup a little bit easier and allows you to ensure that if you want to make sure that this user cannot perform this task, a deny permission is a great way to do that, because that explicit deny will override any other grants to it. And then the unset is basically a default state. So if you don't want to grant access, you don't want to deny access, right? That unset gives you a way to have a default state where if another role were to come across and actually grant the access, right, it's not going to interfere with that in any way. It's just kind of there as not being granted or denied. All right, so another thing you want to keep in mind when you're setting up security is to remember to add company restrictions. So this is something that we run into quite a bit, is that users go in, they set up their roles assigned to the user, and then they come back and say, well, this user has too much access because he has, he really only needs access to 5 legal entities and not the 20 that we have within our organization. And so that's where this company restriction comes into play. Is by default, when you assign a role to a user, that user gets that access across all legal entities within your organization. You then have to take an additional step if you want to restrict that down by going into assign organizations and then selecting which organizations you actually want that user to have access to. Once you assign one organization or legal entity to a user, that user only has that access in legal entities that you list, right? So once one legal entity is set, then that user basically only has that particular access. One thing to keep in mind here is that if you do have a large number of organizations, this can be a very tedious process to go in and select one grant, select one grant, select one grant. Unfortunately, Microsoft doesn't have a great way to automate that particular process, but what you can use are what's called organizational hierarchies. So organizational hierarchy is a way for you to set up a hierarchy of organizations, but basically allows you to diagram out and say, hey, this particular organization actually has all these other organizations underneath it. So if I assign this particular header organization, I want all these other organizations to be assigned automatically. And so, there's actually a organizational hierarchy purpose called security, and that allows you to actually go in and set up the hierarchies that you're going to use for security. And I have a blog post on this that goes into detail about how to go and set this up. But it's the same process. The only difference would be is in this select organizational hierarchy area, instead of saying all legal entities, you actually drop that down and you can actually select the organizational hierarchy that you want to use. So if we have time, I can go in and demo how to perform this, but that's really the only difference there. And there is a blog post that goes through this. All right, so another thing we wanted to mention here is being able to utilize least privilege security and the methodology around least privilege security. So first off, we have to know what is least privilege security. And this is really just being able to determine what access a user should have access to and minimizing that access within the organization, right? So we have to determine what this user does on a day-to-day basis and then determine what security actually allows the user to perform that process within the system. So next question is, why would we want to do this, right? Why would we want to spend the time and effort to go in and do least privilege security? And there's really three different points that I want to drive home here. The first is that it's going to minimize the environmental risk of the user. So if you remove access from the user, you're removing the ability for them to intentionally or inadvertently perform actions that could put your company at risk, right? I would say more times than not, it's inadvertent action, right? That a user doesn't understand what a particular, parameter or a particular function actually does behind the scenes, and they're just trying to get something else to work, and they change something and don't understand the impact of it. But it also would stop from the intentionally somebody trying to go in and perform fraud against your organization, right? So that's the first reason why you'd want to do this. The second is that it's going to lower the licensing costs because as we've kind of mentioned previously, though, the licensing is going to be tied directly to your user access, right? So if you can lower the level of access for a user, you can potentially save your company a lot of money on the licensing costs. And then the final piece here is reducing segregation of duties risk, right? So if you lower the access that a user has in your organization, you're also lowering the amount of risk that they have potentially. And so, if you're removing access, you can then go in and lower the number of segregation duties violations, and therefore the amount of time and effort you'd have to go in and mitigate those as well. So, all right, so kind of going on top of that, if we try to utilize, how do we actually go in and set this up, right? So there's a couple different approaches when we're talking about setting up security, and it's specifically looking at least privilege security. You can, these are terms that I've coined. These aren't Microsoft terms by any means, but there are a couple different options. One is a top-down approach. So when you're looking top-down, you're going to be utilizing security that Microsoft already has and then trying to remove access from those. So basically taking out-of-the-box security, modifying it to remove the extra access around it. So trying to shave off, things that the user doesn't need. Obviously, this is going to be faster because you're already starting off with current security and then you're trying to remove security from it. The cons with it is that the fact that the user can still be over provisioned, just based on the fact that it's very difficult to go in and remove individual processes and objects from a role, duty, or privilege unless you really spend the time and effort to know what those individual pieces do. The next approach you can take is a bottom up. This would be what I would consider the least privilege security approach. This would be where you're starting from, defining what a user does on a day-to-day basis, building out those tasks and processes, and then building security around those. So one of the pros here is that it is true least privilege security. It's going to be slower to implement and more expensive to implement. But again, you're getting that least privilege security at the end of the day. The next approach is a hybrid of the two. And so this is where you can go in and utilize the best of both worlds. And this is the approach that, us from FastPath recommend to a majority of our customers when we're kind of going through, an implementation or upgrade scenario, because it gives you the ability to take different, basically the idea is that you would identify where high risk areas in your system are, utilize least privilege security around those high risk areas, and then being able to, for other areas that you may not care about or that may fall outside of scope of audit, you can use out of the box security from Microsoft. And so this gives you the ability to do least privilege security around your high risk areas, but also utilize the already designed security from Microsoft in areas that you may not care about or maybe a lower risk to your organization. So just a couple of different points here that I wanted to point out. All right, and so if you were a part of the session that Andre and I did earlier, we kind of mentioned a couple different features and functionality. We just glanced over top of them that you could utilize, but we'll go into a little more depth here. So the first is around Extensible Data Security, or XDS. So anytime, this is basically Microsoft's answer to record level security that existed in previous versions of AX, or if you have utilized other systems, CRM has, or what's now D365 for sales or service operations, anything that's on that side of the house implements, has the ability to do basically record level security. This is Microsoft's answer to that on the F&O side. So this basically allows you, anytime you're going in and saying, I want a user to have access to customers, but I only want them to see customers of a particular type, or anytime you're trying to restrict what a user can actually see within a particular type of object, that's going to be XDS. And so there's the process for around this is a little bit complex at first, but it's something that as you go through and start developing these, right, you can get much more comfortable with from this. So in my example here, on the top, I just granted access to customers to a particular user. What I then did is I actually built out what's called an XDS policy, where I went in and defined how I wanted to actually restrict access to this particular user. So the user still has access to customers. I'm basically placing, from a technical side, I'm either placing a where or on statement for all of my SQL calls, and therefore I can restrict down which customers they're actually seeing in this case, right? So in this case, I went and set up a security policy that had a cus group of 10, and so therefore I'm only going to be able to see customers with a cus group of 10. So on the bottom screenshot there, you can actually see that I've restricted, and I'm not seeing the any cus group that has, or a customer that has a cus group of 20. The tough part with XDS is that it's done in code, and you can't do it from the user interface or the security configuration, right? So that kind of eliminates or adds an extra barrier to this, because a lot of the times the business doesn't have access, or a business user doesn't have access to the code side. So there is a little bit more of a barrier to actually implement this. And the other part to it is that it must be done carefully, especially when you're doing complex policies, or if you're trying to put an XDS policy on a transactional table. You want to be very careful about that for the potential performance impact, just the same way you would on a SQL call if you were making that same call within SQL Server Management Studio. You want to be careful on what the potential impact of that is. But this is the only way that you can go in and actually restrict what records a user has access to within F&O. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is the table permission framework, and this is a way to protect high risk data, or high business impact data is what Microsoft calls it. Things like credit cards, social security numbers, etc., things like that. And what this, or how this works, is that there's a parameter on the tables and fields, table fields within F&O, and each of them have an extra parameter called AOS authorization. So if you see this flip to yes, that means AOS authorization is turned on. If it's set to no, obviously it's off. What this basically means is that when this record, either the table or the table field, is accessed, the AOS comes in and does a secondary check to see whether or not the user is explicitly granted rights to this. So you can have full control to the menu item above it, but if you don't have, in this case, explicitly assigned access to the tax license num field on the cust table, right? It's gonna throw an error when that record tries to load, because that user doesn't have the necessary rights to this particular table field in this case. So to set this up, you actually have to grant the explicit rights to in this case, the tax license num table field to the user for them to be able to have that access. And the nice thing here is that Microsoft actually improved this, the process for this from AX2012 to FNO, in that you can apply it at the table or the field level, and you can go directly to either one of those and turn it on. Before in AX2012, you had to if you wanted to apply it to a particular table field, you had to apply it at the table and then go to each field and turn it and say yes or no. Now you can just go directly to the table field and turn it on. All right, and so we talked about earlier about the deny permission, and I just wanted to show an example of how you could actually implement this. So one of the requests that we get quite often is that, I want a user to be able to interact with the sales order lines, but not actually interact with the sales order header, right? And so how do we achieve that? And so that's exactly what you can do with the deny permission, right? Because again, the deny permission is that explicit deny, so it's going to override any other grants. So what we do here is we grant read permission to the sales order. We then go down to the sales order, the sales table, we grant read permission to the sales order header. We then go down to the sales order table and deny the permission to update, create, and delete. But we still then give full control of those sales order lines as well. And so what this does is that it's actually going to restrict the access here for this particular user, right? So you can see on the left-hand side is me just assigning normal access to the sales order itself, and I have full control. I have edit, new, and delete here. On the right-hand side, you can see it's taken away. The save button here is enabled, but you can't save anything. There's nothing to actually save. So that's just how Microsoft shows it. So you can see here that the new and delete are actually restricted. Yeah, so Fade, that's a great question. So a question popped up: is it possible to limit user access to some objects by security configuration other than using code? Not all system admin people are technical enough to write code. Yes. Are you asking about XDS specifically? Between the two, if you're comparing the security configuration page and the AOT, they mimic each other quite a bit. I'd say there's probably 90% overlap between what the two can do. There are certain security scenarios that can only be done in the user interface, and there are certain security scenarios that can only be done in the AOT. So yeah, so if you were specifically about XDS, you can't do that from the user interface. That's a decision by Microsoft. I believe the reasoning behind it is the fact that the security policies are actually code elements, right? And so you really can't create those from the user interface. And that's one of the things we talk about here, I think, actually on the next slide coming up, is the separation between your design time and runtime areas. And so because you'd actually have to create code elements for XDS, right, it would cause issues there. So I'll be sure to jump in and grab some more questions here. Here at the end of the slide, I left some time here, but I want to make sure I get through this. So feel free to continue to put your questions in. I'll be sure to circle back there. All right, so like I mentioned, you want to make sure you know where your security is stored, because your security is going to where you modify security is going to dictate where that security is actually stored. And this is, again, because of that separation that I just mentioned about where your design time and runtime are not on the same machines. Where you're designing the code and where you're designing or developing your code is not where that code is ran. And so because of this, Microsoft had to make a decision, and I apologize that these screenshots are a little blown up. But the idea is that if you make a change to security in the AOT, that change is going to be stored as code within your system. So you can actually see it's a one-to-one matchup that I can actually see the XML documents that are coming from that security roles that are in the system. If I make a change to security within the security configuration area, that's actually going to be stored as data within the database. So it's not written back to the AOT as code. It's actually stored separately. And so what happens is that the security configuration or the security framework, when it's coming through and looking to see what the actual security is, it actually takes a combination of both your AOT and user interface and creates one runtime to be delivered to the end user, right? So this is kind of where you have to make a decision from a business standpoint to determine how you are actually going to make changes to security. Because if you have some users going into the AOT and making changes and some users that are going in through the user interface and making changes, it can be very difficult to actually deliver or make sure your security is compliant across or that you basically anytime you're trying to migrate security, then it's very difficult because you're trying to figure out what security you're going to pick from which area to actually move. So yeah, you just want to make sure that you have a process around where security changes are going to be done and moving that security from environment A to environment B. All right, so utilizing security diagnostics for task recordings. This is a new feature within FNO that was introduced. So the first things first are task recordings. What are they? They're native to AX and FNO. They're basically allow you to go in and record yourself performing a task or process within the user interface, and then recording the steps that you've performed. They're normally used for documentation or testing purposes, but you can also use those as a byproduct to actually pull out the secureable objects that are actually necessary to perform that task or process and to help set up security, right? But there is a feature from Microsoft that's available in the system administration area that is called security diagnostics for task recordings, that you can take a task recording and go in there and actually see what objects are utilized. The problem is that there are some gaps with that. So it only works for menu item displays. It doesn't pull in outputs or actions. It doesn't show you the access required for an object, and it doesn't show menu items tied to forms. So if you have a form control that actually calls a menu item action, it doesn't show that. And then it can analyze. There are certain security scenarios where Microsoft actually does the actual security in code, or it's stored in tables, and so that gets a little bit hairy on how that actually all obviously it doesn't pull that in from that perspective. So there are gaps there. There are other tools to help with this. I've developed one at FastPath. There's also a free version up on my GitHub for this. But this feature does exist natively within FNO as well. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this because this was one of my favorite ways to test security until Microsoft broke it in one of their recent updates. So there was a hidden feature within FNO called View with Role Set that you could actually go in and modify, basically create mock-up security, launch a test workspace, and actually see what launched a test workspace as a user assigned to these roles, right? So this was a great feature. I use it for testing all the time, and had that was one of the first things I would do in a new environment was add this Visual Studio extension. Unfortunately, since PU32, Microsoft has broken this, right? So if you try to launch it, you're going to get an error. And so I kind of left myself in a position where I needed a way to more easily test security. And so this is, again, if you were in our previous session, I mentioned this project. This is something that I've been working on for a while. And what I did is I tried to make a tool that would utilize both the best of AX 2012 and FNO features and functionality, because this feature did exist in AX 2012 as well, where you could launch a test workspace. So this isn't released yet. I'm going through some legal issues with FastPath to get us released, but it will be on my GitHub in some way, shape, or form soon. The idea is that you'd be able to set up security kind of like you did in the view with role set, where you would be able to pull different security in from the available security and actually set it up and launch test workspace. The couple of things that I've added here are the ability to use roles, duties, and privileges. So you can actually combine or create a custom or a mock-up, again, a particular role, duty, or privilege that includes, or you can mock up a role that would include roles, duties, and privileges, and you can pull in user roles from a user. So you could say, what would happen if I added this role to the user, if I remove this role to the user, right? What could they do? So again, this is not released yet, but if you follow me on LinkedIn, Twitter, GitHub, right, it'll be available soon. And you can use this to help with your security design. All right, so segregation duties and mitigations are the next area. I'm gonna kind of fly through these because I know we have questions coming in here. But really, if you're going to use, if you have internal, external audit requirements, if you have any audit, auditory regulations that you're trying to meet, there is a segregation duties function for Microsoft. The one thing to keep in mind is that there are some limitations around it, right? So the first thing is that Microsoft segregation duties is done at the duty level. You basically set up and say its conflict is going to be between duty 1 and duty 2. If users assign both of these, that's going to be considered a conflict. There's a number of gaps that happen because of this, especially around the fact that obviously there's security lower than a duty, right? There's privileges, there's objects, and just because a duty is named a particular thing doesn't mean that's what it actually does. Also, the fact that you can go in and you can assign privileges directly to roles means that you can bypass the duty assignment altogether. So you could have literally a user assigned every privilege in the system, and it wouldn't get picked up by the Microsoft SOD tool, right? So there are definitely different gaps in this. The other piece of this is that any security change done at the duty level or privilege level, then it requires you to revalidate your rule set to make sure that it's still valid, right? So if I'm making changes to my duties or privileges and I add in new security or remove security, right, I need to revalidate that my SOD rules are still correct. And then there's no out-of-the-box rule set from Microsoft, so you have to create your own as an end user. We want to make sure that we understand how to utilize the process controls and mitigations, right? The idea here is that you're never going to be able to get to zero SOD risk in your organization. So you want to make sure that you have process controls or mitigations around these to help with this process, right? So the process controls or mitigations are utilized when a user access that's causing an SOD risk can't be removed because they need that access to perform their day-to-day operations. And there's a number of different, process controls, mitigations you can use. Transaction sampling workflows is a huge one within F&O. That comes into play quite a bit. And again, you're not going to be able to get to zero risks in your organization, so you want to make sure you're blending your security and process controls together, right? Minimize your SOD risk as far as you can, and then have process controls mitigations around the rest. All right, so user management. The big thing with this user management piece, and you're going to hear this again and again, is to have a process for doing any sort of user modification, right? And make sure that you're following that process, right? So, the process should include the user being provisioned, the access the user requires, who needs to actually approve the request, and then the time duration that it should be active, right? Does this user need this access going forward indefinitely, or should they be revoked this access at some, are they only covering for somebody else and we need to revoke this access going forward? Another thing you want to keep in mind is monitoring user logins. There's a report in system administration inquiries, the user log, and this really will protect you for users that are logging in either outside of work hours, or being able to notify that, or if somebody's logging in, logging out consecutively, you might want to ask them what's going on or why this is happening. So just to keep an idea of it, of what's going on within your system, you can easily monitor those as well. And again, when we're talking about changing a user's access for user management, right, you want to make sure that you have an idea of, first off, why does the user access change? You have employee promotions, right, or changing within the organization, their role, employee sick leave or vacation, right? You have firefighter access. That's a huge one, where a user needs elevated permissions for a short amount of time and then they need to be revoked. Backup user access, right? So if you're, backup to somebody else that needs to perform a critical task, you need this access for a short amount of time. Or employee termination, right? Removing that access. So the questions you need to be asking is, is this request temporary or permanent? Who's going to assign or remove the access? And is the process documented for audit review, right? Do you have some sort of audit chain to review that process at some point in time? All right. Finally, the best practices here. There's a couple of them here that I wanted to go through. Never making security changes directly in production. Again, I'm going to harp on this again until for as long as I can do sessions here, is the fact that you want to treat your security as code. And once you get in that mindset, especially if you have developers that are making your security changes, right, this will help them kind of get in the mindset of how they should view security. If they treat it the same way as they treat code, it's going to go through the same ALM process, or application lifecycle management process, as well as the same testing and everything else that your code goes through. So you don't want to be making security changes like the top screenshot there, where you're going to dev, making your changes, then going to test, making your changes, then going to prod and making your changes, right? Instead, you want to be going in and looking at making your changes in dev, then doing code promotion to test, QA, UAT, whatever you have, and then going to prod again through that promotion process, right? So going through that process, or using ALM and going through the actual dev, test, prod hierarchy structure there, is going to provide you a much more complete and solid footing for your security changes. And again, we talked about this before, but taking a risk-based approach to your reviews, setup, and tracking, you can apply this idea across any number of different security topics within F&O, but you want to make sure that you're focusing in on your high-risk areas whenever you're doing either a review, when you're doing your setup or your tracking, right? Not every access, not every object in the application is at the same risk level, right? So you want to categorize these objects or accesses into levels, high, low, medium, high, whatever they are. And then your reviews should focus in on your high risk access, right? Because that's where it's going to give you the greatest ROI. It's going to be less data to review, more accurate for reviews overall, because you have less data and you can spend less time on your reviews, right? Once you go through, maybe after, during your cycle, you go through your high risk first, and then you work your way down to your medium and low behind the scenes. And then one big thing, and we kind of touched on this again on the previous session that I've done, but the idea is that security is more than just dynamics, right? If you're going in and focusing in and saying, I want to get my dynamic security set up correctly, that's great. But you also need to look at other systems in your organization and making sure that they're following the same processes as well. Because if your dynamic system security is set up correctly, but systems that connect to that system are not, so things like your Power Platform, your Power BI, your analytics, your whatever system connects to F&O, right? If that security is not set up correctly, then your F&O security is not set up correctly, because you still have risk coming in from other systems within your organization. So I actually do an entire session just on the rings of security, but basically you want to kind of build your way out. You can think of it where your database is at the middle, your applications on the next ring out, your network and infrastructure, and then finally your end user is on the outside. And so you want to make sure that each of those levels, as well as the other applications that interact with these, are all following the same level of scrutiny that your F&O environment is. So with that, I'll go ahead and start answering questions that have been in the queue. I want to put up my information here. This slide deck, as well as the slide deck I used earlier today with Andre, is up on my website. You can find it at the link there. Again, my blog is listed there and my contact email. So we can go through some of the questions.
So I can read questions for you.
Yep.
So the question from Soeb is, what is your opinion on relationship between license and security?
Yeah, so that's a great question. They're intertwined. You really can't look at one without the other, because your licensing is going to be tied directly to your security. And I actually write about user licensing all the time on my blog as well. But the changes that Microsoft has been making as well have made it extremely difficult to do that type of reporting, to show how the what licenses the user has, as well as how why they need that particular license. But there's a direct correlation between what security is assigned to the user to what licenses they need, simply because of how Microsoft does their licensing. So if you have questions about that, you can feel free to reach out. Or like I said, I have an entire blog series just on user licensing within FNO.
Sure, thanks. So another question from Alim is asking about denying permissions to export to Excel or copy cut functions. And further extension to that question is there a simple way to enable export to Excel functions on a specific user group without customization? Eventually limit export or copy data from all forms, maybe 10, 20, 30 lines max, even then 100K lines, for example.
Right.
I know that for AX2012, a customization is necessary to limit access for export tasks.
So there's a couple different questions in here. The first one is deny permission. Is it possible to deny permissions to export Excel? Yes. So that first question is yes. Anytime you see the export to Excel button, you do have the ability to go in and actually deny. In some cases, it's a data entity, right? So you can actually just deny access to the data entity, and that will remove that functionality. And again, I'm sorry to keep saying that, I do have a blog post around that particular function. Other times, if it's just a grid, that's a little bit, and you're just exporting directly from the grid itself, that's a much more that's a trickier ask, because you'll if you're just worried about seeing the data, right? Because the user can see the data within FNO if they can get to the grid itself. So exporting isn't there's not a good way to, I guess, disable that functionality that I know of, at least. But as far as, you still wouldn't be able to, unless they have access to the data, and you wouldn't be able to actually modify data going back in to FNO. Your questions about the number of lines exported is actually something I don't know about. As far as exporting just a set number of lines, that functionality, as far as the exporting, is all controlled by Microsoft. I don't know if you have the ability to say, hey, only export this number of lines. I think you would have to probably, like you said in X2012, create a customization to do that.
All right, there is another question from Farhan. Based on your experience, considering performance impact, what are the best practices you recommend in case a user group needs limited access to few customers or account groups?
Yeah, Farhan, in that case, again, the only way that you're going to be able to implement that is through XDS. Luckily, I guess in your case, customers and account groups. I don't know about account groups, I guess, specifically, but I do know customers is a fairly easy table to actually go in and place XDS on without a huge performance impact. But both of those are master data, right? So they're not transactional. So you're not going to impose the same level of performance impact that you would if you were trying to do this around a transactional table. So again, Andre and myself both have blog posts on XDS. If you have questions, you can reach out afterwards as well.
Yep. There is another question from Kyle about a request he received about denying access to manager cost for this whole sales admin role. So he's asking about how to identify tables containing this field so that he can perform a specific task to hide that access.
Right. So if it's if it's only one field, right? At the end of the day, that field, I shouldn't say all the time, but a majority of the time, if it's a particular field you're trying to, yeah, if you're a particular field you're trying to deny, then it's going to live on one table. There is the option to actually go in. You can right click on a particular field, go to form information. If you're logged in as a sysadmin, I should say, you can right click on a field, go to form information, and actually go to the dialog will pop out of the right hand side. You can go to administration and actually see the table and field and menu item that's actually coming from. It's the same process as the right click personalization that existed within AX 2012. So that's how I get normally how I get access to it. The only other way you can do it is through the AOT and actually looking to see how that form is actually being generated. You can go in and get the data source from it there. But in your case, you're probably looking at field level security where you can actually deny access to a particular field. And so that's, once you figure out the table and field, then you can go in and deny that access. But I would try one of those two routes, either going in, right clicking form information, and going through that particular form or going through the AOT itself.
So there is another question from Sahil, and he's asking about if the privilege on action menu item, if the privilege changes the license configuration from team or activity to operations, what is the best approach or workaround to manage this? For example, approve vendor disbursement journals.
Right. So, yeah, that kind of comes down to a business decision. Obviously, you can break that apart and have one privilege that just does the operations level, and then one that does the team activity. And assign the team activity privilege to, your list of users, and then only assign the operations level to the ones that need it, right? So you can go. There's a couple different ways you can break it apart that way, or at the end of the day, another option is just to have a lower number of users actually require that particular access. So it kind of is a business decision on which is the best approach. I've seen both being done where, where previously, a company may have 100 users performing this task. Now they break it down and only have, 25 do the actual approvals, whatever. Or you can, again, if you need all 100 to be able to actually do the team member activity level tasks and processes, right? Then you can break it out into those multiple privileges, and that way, you can separate out and your operations level licensing to only the users that need it.
That's all I see from the questions.
Awesome.
Thank you, Alex. If anyone needs any help on or further explanation on any of the questions, Alex has already shared his email, and he has offered to help. So if you need anything, do visit his blog for the questions he has answered. And I think that's it with this session.
Awesome.
So
thank you.
We are right on time. Thank you, Alex. So our next session is from Andrew, who is going to talk about the master planning and demand forecasting with your supply chains. So Andrew, are you online?
I am here.
All right, over to you.
All right, great. Screen up. Always fun to trail Alex in a session. He's always been a popular lead in the community, and I always enjoy his sessions. So hopefully I can do him justice and finish off the day here strong with us. Thank you everybody for joining. This is my first chance I've gone to speak at FinOps Power Summit or a D365 Saturday event. So I am really excited to talk to you all today about how to make master planning and demand forecasting and fit your supply chain in Dynamics 365. A quick introduction on myself while we're getting started here. I know we're a couple minutes early. Once again, my name is Andrew Lensack. I'm the Director of Solution Delivery at Arbella Technologies Incorporated, sharing you with my contact information here. I've been in the Dynamics space since about 2008. I started off working for a manufacturer in the life science industries who mainly photonics manufacturer manufacturing instruments for the study of light. So most of our customers were research labs, college universities, healthcare, NASA, and the like. Really got getting my start doing lean time studies, production planning, engineering management, data management, doc and data control management. That led to a role as a business analyst with that organization, supporting 12 legal entities across the world, in Asia, in Europe, in North and South America. And I did that for quite some time and really got a passion for Microsoft and Dynamics specifically. And that's when I got into the consulting side many years ago. As a consultant, I've served roles as a business analyst, as a functional and senior consultant, and as a solution architect. Now a good part of my job is people management as well, and helping build out our practice in the F&O space. I'm an active member in the user group community. I've spoken at User Group Summit previously, Dynamics Con, and now D365 Saturdays and the Power FinOps Summit. A quick introduction about Arbella, the company I work for. We are an inner circle for Microsoft Dynamics partner. A little bit of stats here, about a little over 200 people now worldwide, 100 of which specifically are for the ERP space. So when we're talking about Dynamics 365, where I spend my days with my clients, that's almost half of all of our resources worldwide focusing on that, whereas myself and my team focus on distribution, trade and logistics, and manufacturing clients. So here to talk to you today about some of those things that I do on a daily basis and how we can help clients and how Microsoft can help clients align their sales and operating procedures with master planning and demand forecasting in Dynamics. So a little bit about our agenda today. We're going to start off with S&OP strategies, what you need to think about when you're implementing Dynamics, because it's not just aligning the right tools or having the tools do calculations for you. It's having those tools actually match what you're trying to achieve as a business. Are you trying to reduce inventory? Are you trying to reduce lead times? Are you trying to reduce costs? And not all of those things can always be done at the same time, and knowing what tools are available to you is truly important, because you don't want your finance team trying to achieve one objective and then your planners and your production are trying to achieve a completely different objective and kind of not using the system in a fully functional way that can support the business. So we'll break it down by three kind of traditional or known business models: make to stock, make to order, and configure or engineer to order. We'll talk about forecasting in Dynamics, what that means, different types of supply forecasting, and different types of demand forecasting. And that can be very basic forecasting, or it can be using time series models and Azure machine learning to calculate your demand forecast for you. We'll also get into coverage planning, what that actually means. What level do you want to plan at? How granular do you want to plan at to achieve what you need to get the right materials at the right times for production and for purchasing, and what options you have when you're setting those up. We'll talk about one of my favorite forms in Dynamics, probably one of the hidden gems that's been around for a little while now, but it's a bit of an unsung hero. Doesn't really get talked about a lot, but a very powerful form in the supply chain, which is supply schedules. And we'll also talk about delivery date control, aligning your sales order entry with the rest of your business, with your supply chain, so you're promising the right dates to customers, so you're not missing those dates, so you know how to react to them, and so that you can manage them as those dates perhaps change going into the future. So to start off with, Apex defines S&OP as the function of setting the overall level of manufacturing output or a production plan and other activities to best satisfy the current plan levels of sales. That can be a sales plan, that can be forecasts, truly entered sales demand, while meeting the general business objectives of profitability, productivity, competitive customer lead times, etc., as expressed in the overall business plan. So really what we're trying to say here is, when you're setting up a strategy, when you're setting up master planning, when you're thinking about how you want to actually implement Dynamics, you really need to focus on your entire supply chain. Often when we get into these projects, it'll be something like this. We'll get a procurement or a trade and logistics consultant that could be or could not be the same as your sales consultant. You'll have a manufacturing consultant and a manufacturing team. They may or may not be associated with the engineering group. you have inventory, and now in more advanced systems, we have warehouse management and transportation management. And if those groups aren't talking to each other, then setting up D365 in the way your business needs can be really, really difficult. For example, when it comes to sales, do you have a heavy quoting process? Do you know how your delivery dates are actually promised to customers? Do you have a known method in how you give them their lead times, or is that always changing? And does the rest of the supply chain know how your customer service organization is promising orders to customers? Do you have KPIs that are the same for all customers? Maybe if you have a larger set of distributors that you work with and then small customers who only buy once a month, you have different lead time and efficiencies that you want to measure for those different groups. When it comes to purchasing, same thing. Do you have vendors that are able to deliver same day or next day versus some vendors who might be in different countries or different parts of the world, and they can't get things to you quite so quickly, and you need to hold more safety stock of those items. When it comes to manufacturing, what's your strategy? Do you maintain stock of your WIP and your raw material items, or are you more make to stock and make to order? And when you're setting up manufacturing, are your resources and your work centers interchangeable? Do you have people who have different skill sets that can do different types of assembly and different types of production? Or do you have machines that are limited? Do you have a lathe that can only run certain size metal and certain size wood through it? Without understanding that, without understanding the capacities of those manufacturing cells, you're never going to be able to know what to set up in master planning to make that work for you. Multi-sourcing products. Do you multi-source products, or do you have single vendors for everything? Are your items placed close to point of use when you're setting up inventory and warehousing? Do you use a Kanban system? Do you use an Andon system to alert people when machines break down? One of the things I'm not showing here is asset management. That's a newer module in Dynamics that we haven't had previously that relates to a lot of this. So knowing the entire supply chain, knowing the different pieces, and having these people talk to each other can really help you define what that process should be. This slide here, not to be confused with a map of the Tube or the London Underground, is Microsoft's Master Planning Learning Map from their doc site. This gives you a good overview of functionality of what's in the system, what's available to us, and it's going to tie in a lot of the slides and a lot of the topics I'm going to show you today. For example, setting up your master planning. Do you want a one-plan strategy, or do you need a multi-plan strategy? Some of that might actually change now with newer tools. One of the things you guys might have heard of is planning optimization, and how that's going to drive a much more efficient planning run, a much bigger improvement to the runtime, where we're not actually running our master plan on the server. We're running it as an add-in service, running it in real time, not having to do nightly runs. What can we use in master planning? Handling safety stock, setting up actions and delay messages, tracing, intercompany plans, demand forecasting. All of these tools are available, and knowing how they fit with each other is truly important when you're setting up your master plans, your supply chain, and everything else in Dynamics. So where should we start off? First, let's talk a little bit about make to stock and what tools are available for your company in order to support that type of business. This is a very common or traditional, simple to understand model. It's been being used for decades, if not more than hundreds of years. This is when we use stock levels, typically calculated on historical consumption or forecasting. We manage that stock, we hold that stock. We don't ever want to get to production without having inventory of raw materials or WIP items. So we do that with a safety stock. Some other systems other than D365 consider safety stock sometimes having to do with allocation as well. Safety stock in Dynamics terms can be more commonly referred to maybe as a reorder point, where when a minimum level is hit, that's telling us that we need to reorder that product and restock it so that we don't run out. So that reorder point or your lead time of that item really should represent the level of safety stock that you want to hold in place. This is independent. It's not coming from customer-specific demand. You might have a some level forecast that's driving what those safety stock levels should be. It could be done with a safety stock journal, as I show here in my top screenshot, where Dynamics allows us to actually put in a period of time, a period of historical data to calculate what our safety stock should be. So maybe we want to use, for example, last year's demand for a given item, and we want to hold safety stock over a lead time of 2 weeks and see how much that is. We can use the average consumption over that monthly lead time for the past year to calculate what that number should be. We can also use a standard deviation to calculate that what that should be. So Microsoft in Dynamics 365 and even prior versions like AX 2012 and AX 2009 have a safety stock journal functionality that will do those calculations for you. It's a pretty bare bones, simplistic type of calculation, but can be very useful for those more simple scenarios. Another way of dealing with make to stock, if you're using lean manufacturing, is fixed Kanbans, where think of that as kind of your traditional 1, 2, 3 bin type system. You take a bin, you replace it. As something gets consumed, it needs to be repurchased or remade. Kanban calculations go a little bit further than the safety stock calculations. Not only do they allow us to look at historical data, they allow us to look at future-facing forecasts, future-facing projections, and factor those in to our Kanban calculation. So when we calculate what our new Kanban level should be and how many Kanban we should keep in stock, we can take into to account historical and future projected demand. So a lot of different options. Very important if you're using safety stock is to look at what's set up in the item coverage of your items and your released products. The reason for that is there's actually a date field that calculates or determines when you should purchase or when you should produce or transfer your safety stock levels by. It's called the fulfillment date. It defaults to the current date, meaning if today is January 30th and the system already sees that I'm going to fall below my safety stock, it's telling me I need it today, when I might just be falling just below it, and that lead time or that safety stock level could really be managing for the next 2 weeks, but it would tell me to actually buy it today. Parameter, a few other settings, today's date plus procurement time, or today's date along with the time fence, and push that date out to something that might make more sense to you. So just make sure you're looking at all those different settings when setting up safety stock, when setting up item coverage, to make sure you're getting the results that you want when you're setting up a make to stock scenario. Next, we have make to order, another pretty common or traditional method that a lot of people know about. Standard products are made to order or finished to order. We're not keeping stock of the finished goods. We might not even be keeping stock of WIP or raw material items, depending on how frequently those materials might be used in other products, if they're shared or if they are purely used for this make-to-order scenario. A couple different ways that can be done in Dynamics. One is to create a production or a batch order directly from a sales order. Really popular, really useful. It creates an automatic marking against that transaction, so you have reservation or allocation without having to worry about somebody stealing that inventory once it goes into stock. And even recently, Microsoft introduced the functionality to create a transfer order directly from a sales order line in a new feature management with 10.0.15 or 16. So look out for that feature as well if you're a common make-to-order shop. This is often used because of space constraints, or not enough cash flow to maintain levels of inventory. It's not always because the goods that are being produced or sold are uncommon. Sometimes it's because physical restrictions of your operations don't allow you to hold stock. Maybe you have a lot of other initiatives for a given year. You're buying a new building to open up more space, and currently you don't have enough cash flow to hold in a lot of inventory, so you're moving more of a just-in-time scenario with make-to-order. We also have lean Kanban events that can be used if, once again, in the manufacturing world, where when a sales order is placed, a manufacturing Kanban could be triggered automatically and tell the production floor to actually go and manufacture a product based on that sales order being entered. So it's not waiting for a master planning run. It's not waiting on someone to review those sales orders before committing it to the production schedule or to the production floor or to, in this case, our Kanban board. It's actually being created based on that event rule being set up against lean manufacturing. And then our third kind of objective, or our third scenario for an SNOP strategy, are configure to order. I combined it with engineer to order. Doesn't always have to be that way. Most commonly, it might not be. Configure might not have to do with engineering. That could just be a main SKU. If you think of things like retail, we have t-shirts. We have t-shirts that can be sold in multiple sizes, multiple colors, multiple patterns, etc. Those aren't necessarily going through engineering, but when it comes to placing orders for those, we do need to configure that finished good, where the final operations of the value chain are made to order. Maybe our customer service or the user or buyer themselves are actually configuring the product to say what they want. They're just buying that attribute essentially, rather than maybe managing a specific SKU for every possible combination of goods. So it really helps us eliminate unneeded data entry or unneeded data control if we do have many similar products that have different attributes. If they're not really truly unique, fit, form, and function maybe is the same, but there's little pieces that make them unique. Common, obviously, in the automotive industry, if you have different classes of cars and you can do things like have different paint jobs, leather seats versus cloth seats, different options on your dashboard and stereo. Configure to order is allowing someone to actually place those options and come up with what that finished good should be. Engineer to order is when products are not kept in stock. We see this a lot with OEM manufacturers. Even the WIP or raw materials might not be standard products. They're very often managing the projects module in Dynamics to do this, to actually have a project per type, whether that's for different customers or a new product line you want to offer. Custom orders are placed against those specific needs for your customers and start in the development phase. And a lot of times you don't want that to mess with your regular production schedule. You don't want to necessarily create items that might not be used if they need to go through an engineering phase and it turns out later on you're not going to mass produce that product. So that's very often why we choose to use the projects module. You'll also see combinations of use with a PLM tool, a product lifecycle management tool. That could be one that integrates with Dynamics. It might be one that doesn't integrate with Dynamics. There's a lot of good ones out there. Our Blue Star PLM tool is really good, and a lot of Dynamics customers use that, for example. And that could be integration, or those could be separate processes that you have to combine when you're taking an item out of your PLM or your ECM tool and bringing it into Dynamics 365. In my next slide, I'll actually touch upon some new features that have come out just recently in Dynamics 365 to address maybe some of those inefficiencies or gaps we've seen in previous iterations of Dynamics. So a new feature highlights something that has just really come out recently. Many of us may know the product lifecycle state. It's been there in Dynamics 365 pretty much the whole time D365 has been out. I believe that was even backported into AX 2012. And it was a fairly simple feature, a fairly standalone feature. It allowed us to give the product a status. It wasn't just utilizing other fields, renaming the search name, putting on the default order setting stopped flags. It actually gave a little bit more meaning to what is this item? Is it a new item? Is it still in engineering? Is it active? Is it obsolete, superseded, whatever it may be? So this feature started off very simply as that, a status. It had these two flags with it. Is it the default status when I release a product to a legal entity? And is it active for planning? So does master planning consider products that are in this status? For example, you wouldn't want obsolete products to have a master planning run. And the reason some of that was needed was because of the default order settings flags. Default order settings are a little bit exclusive. There's a flag for sales, there's a flag for procurement, and there's a flag for inventory. Those flags stop all transactions. So for example, the inventory flag stops transfer orders. It stops inventory journals. It stops production orders. The sales flag stops not only creation of new sales orders, but if you had sales orders that were created prior to that flag getting checked, you couldn't invoice those orders. You couldn't packing slip update those orders. And same thing on the purchasing side. You couldn't place new POs. You couldn't update existing POs that weren't closed. So those stop flags and the status, we needed a better way to merge those. We needed to make this a little bit better, full-fledged functionality. How do we actually control the supply chain, how we need it? Because sometimes when a new item's about to be released, we want to ramp up production, but not allow order entry yet. And sometimes if a product's being obsoleted, we want to allow order entry and stop production or stop purchasing. So in one of the latest updates, Microsoft has introduced added functionality to the product lifecycle state through enabled business processes. We can now select different processes like sales orders, quotations, purchase orders, production orders, and combine them to which transaction specifically we want to either stop or warn. So this doesn't have to be, once again, a be-all, end-all. It's a very flexible solution. You can allow transactions. You can allow transactions while warning the user, or you can put a hard stop on those transactions, which is really, really powerful. Like I said, if I'm ramping up a new product, I might want to allow production, but no other transactions. Maybe we have certain specialized raw materials that we want to allow consumption into production orders, but we don't want to allow other processes to take place. This is going to get us there. So this is one feature that's been introduced in the engineering change module that's just come out, along with a whole set of other features, things like product readiness checks and workflow management for releasing new products. So with supply chain, with S&OP processes, with master planning and forecasting, well, one of the hugely important things is having the right data and having the right items set up prior to actually running those plans. And this one new feature is a really powerful tool in that set. So next, I want to talk about forecasting. We talked a little bit about make to stock, make to order. You know, we can have sales order demand to drive production. We can have that exploded down to our bill of materials to tell us what we need to buy. We can have safety stock at any level, whether that's our production finished good items, our WIP items, our raw material items. But that's not the only way to do business, and sometimes it's not the right way. Occasionally, we need to forecast because maybe we have really long lead times. Maybe we have seasonality that we need to factor in. Maybe we have some unpredictability and we need to factor in different measurements and forecast, whether it be for production or purchasing or sales. So first, we have forecast plans. Actually being able to connect a forecast to the master planning engine. Your master plan produces an output of planned orders that tell your buyers, that tell your manufacturers, that tell your warehouse control guys what to buy, what to make, and what to transfer. But if we want them to have forecast demand also affect that, we need to have a forecast plan. So we tie our forecast plan first to a master plan. Next, we can have different types of forecasts. You can have supply forecast and you can have demand forecast. Supply forecast is a term you don't hear used a lot in the dynamics world, and it's maybe not something you see people use a lot, but it can be really powerful. So for example, maybe I want to level load production. There is one line where the demand is so high and we're capped at capacity and we just need to produce 1,000 a week or 1,000 a month. And sure, you can just go ahead and manually create orders, but occasionally you might need to factor in other things. Maybe you don't want to do that full stop. Maybe you want to factor in other demand that could affect that machine. Supply forecast can be used for level loading production without being affected by sales demand. Sales demand wouldn't consume a supply forecast like it would a demand forecast. Supply forecasts can also be used as alternative ways to manage WIP and raw material inventory. Rather than having a safety stock, you can have supply forecasts, and those could actually be reduced by purchase orders if it is a purchased raw material, for example. So I have a supply forecast of 1,000 a month. I place a PO here in January of 500. That reduces that supply forecast down to 500 units remaining. So similar concept to like what we see on the demand or the sales forecasts. You don't really see the sales forecast term used specifically a lot anymore. In AX 2012, Microsoft introduced what was called the demand forecasting functionality. This allowed the system to actually calculate forecasts for you. Previously, you were using a homegrown method. Maybe you had a forecast in Excel. You imported that into Dynamics. Maybe you were using SlimStock or RockySoft or Farsight Solutions, and then bringing that into your forecast plan and your master plan. But with AX 2012 and now more powerfully with D365, we actually have the ability to use models in Dynamics with other tools. 2012, that other tool being SQL Server Analysis Services, and in D365, that other tool being Azure Machine Learning, to actually help calculate time series forecasts. So demand forecasting, it can be based on our customer demand. It can be based on any source of demand really that can cause what we call an issue transaction, decrementing inventory, sales orders, production consumption, Kanban consumption, bomb line consumption, whatever it may be, and take that into consideration when creating a demand forecast. So I'm going to get really kind of into that tool here in the next couple slides to talk about what that offers and how that can really ramp up your supply chain and your master planning processes. These two graphs here show two forms that are really powerful from that tool. The adjusted demand forecast, which is the output of the statistical forecasting demand forecast tool in D365. That allows you to look at it in multiple levels. I can look at it at an item level. I can look at it at an item allocation or item family level. I could look at demand broken out and forecast summed up for every item into a particular warehouse, or maybe the entire forecast for my company. I can also look cross-company at multiple legal entity forecasts within this tool. And then from there, I have the ability to reforecast, authorize that forecast into my master plan. I can look at historical demand and forecast graphically. So we actually have some built-in KPIs. We see a lot of people using Power BI now to compare things year over year, for example, as well, and extracting this data from Dynamics 365 after it's been brought in. So continuing on with demand forecasting, what is it? So as obviously we were never able to forecast Dynamics specifically. This is a tool that runs with Azure Machine Learning. There are 5 out-of-the-box time series models that are offered, and it gives you the ability to also add your own in Azure to your Azure Machine Learning experiment and bring those into Dynamics. So this top diagram kind of covers the standard flow or process of demand forecasting with Dynamics. Once you've set your base parameters about what time series models you want to use, if you need to factor in seasonality, if you need to have parameters for missing demand, for example, if you had a month of no demand last year, you would set those first. The system then, when you go to generate your statistical forecast, would gather transactional historical data from the database and bring it into Microsoft Machine Learning to use the time series models like ARIMA, like seasonal trend decomposition, like exponential smoothing, and generate and bring back a forecast into that adjusted demand forecast form we saw in the previous slide. Once there, the user has the ability to view that data, view the demand that the demand and the time series model that came up with that data. They can change that data and be able to audit and track what changes were made, commit those changes if they want to, or authorize that forecast for use in the master plan, or it might drive them to change their parameters and reforecast again. So when you're doing this, you have a lot of kind of power at your hands. You have the ability to generate those forecasts, bring them back in. You have the support for intercompany planning. You can use tools like outlier removal. If last year I had a new customer come in and I don't expect them to return year over year, but they placed a huge order, that could really skew my forecast for the following year. So outlier removal is a query-based option, similar to going into advanced filter sort or querying on a report or querying on a table in Dynamics, and choose what customers, what items, specific transactions, specific dimensions even, that you might want to exclude from your historical data when you generate the forecast, so it's not skewing it when it returns what your adjusted demand forecast should be. The other piece about this is there's a lot of different ways to run it. So you need to kind of look for some tips and tricks. You need to have repeatable results. For a future forecast, for example, you might want to generate 12 to 24 months and actually be using the system for quite some time before you get to see the seasonal trends. So even though you might future forecast out and say, show me the next 12 to 24 months, because of that seasonality, because of that variability, you might only be approving or authorizing the next 3 to 6 months forecasts. So things like a freeze time fence that we have the ability to do in Dynamics 365 can help to say, well, don't edit the next few months. Those are locked in because we can't react within the lead time, but maybe future forecasts in the next year, 18 months, likely to change. We reforecast maybe monthly, maybe quarterly. We won't commit those just yet. Another question I hear a lot about demand forecasting as I change over to my next slide here is, well, what if we're going live on Dynamics 365? The database doesn't have that history. We were working with our partner and we chose to use a data warehouse, or we said it would be too hard to migrate transactional data, especially closed sales orders, closed production orders and such, in a D365. Well, one good thing is there is a data entity for that, a historical external demand, where you can load previous demand into that staging table and have the statistical forecasting process read that. Once it does, you set up the system. As I said, there's parameters for seasonality. There's parameters for min-max levels. So maybe we never want to forecast more than 500,000 units, even if our demand is that high, because we don't have the capacity for it. You can set those thresholds. You can set parameters for missing data points. If I had a month of no sales, but that's not something I would ever project, maybe I want to use the mean or the previous forecast period's value, I can set that in my parameters as well. Our item allocation keys, this is a prerequisite for demand forecasting where you have to group items into item families for the purposes of the aggregate forecasting. Another piece of the aggregate forecasting is a forecast unit of measure. I might have finished goods that are in pounds, that are in eaches, that are in square yards. And if I tried to aggregate those all into an item family, it wouldn't make any sense. So having a demand forecast unit of measure that's consistent for all products is a key to setting up this module. And then you have to have unit conversions from the demand forecasting unit of measure to the items unit of measure to make sure that the aggregate forecasting will work appropriately. What models are available? Like I said, we have ARIMA, which is a Box-Jenkins method, very good for long-term smoothing, predictability. Doesn't do a whole lot, though, when we need to, say, weigh certain levels of time more heavily or lightly than others. Then we might need to look at some of those other options, like ETS, exponential smoothing, or seasonal trend decomposition. There's a couple combination type models. And then there's a model called ALL. This is one that probably my clients see the most use of when they're trying to fit this tool, because you might not know what option is the best for you, especially if demand forecasting is a new strategy for your company. So ALL will actually calculate your forecast using every method that's available in the Azure Machine Learning model and return a forecast that came from the model with the lowest mean absolute percentage error. So it'll actually do all the calculations for you. One caveat to that is if you have many, many items and a lot of history that you're calculating, that is going to be a little bit more performance intensive. So if you're talking, tens of thousands of SKUs and year or two worth of data, that could run for a really long time, especially if you use the ALL model. That might be something where you want to look at the licensing of your Azure subscription. The demand forecasting experiment is free. You don't have to buy any additional D365 licenses to use it if you're already using production and master planning. However, for performance reasons, you might want to look at a business level or an enterprise edition for Azure if you start to see some of those performance issues in the Azure machine learning model with Dynamics 365. Another thing that comes up often before we switch to another topic is, where can this tool improve? Demand forecasting is still new to Dynamics. There's a lot of other companies where this is their bread and butter and they offer add-on solutions for it. This is just one small tool set in the Dynamics toolset box. So one, the ability to have multiple working adjusted demand forecasts at the same time. You can be kind of restricted into how you use this, especially if you have multiple planners. Exception reporting, there are the mean absolute percentage and the outlier removal, which can kind of get you some type of exceptions. But when you see those outliers month over month, year over year, there's nothing out of the box that will really highlight those. We see a lot done in Power BI to help clients pick out those exceptions. I'd love to see more out of the box KPIs and graphical features. This top one is a waterfall chart we've built in Power BI from a demand forecast that we did in Dynamics 365. And we also very often help our clients with an archiving process to compare multiple models. Maybe I want to run a REMA and I want to run STL and I want to compare those. I don't want the system to just return me the best result. I want me to show it all results and I want to compare them and I want to maintain that year over year. Part of this forecasting process, data gets overwritten. So having something where we can archive things, where we can compare things is really powerful. This bottom screenshot is actually from Farsight Solutions demand forecasting add-in. They have a tool that does new item introduction and obsolescence. So actually taking a new item, linking it to an existing item so we can use that history and not having to manually fill in that history ourselves. This is something a lot of demand forecasting packages and solutions have that we don't yet have in the Dynamics 365 out of the box engine. That could be really powerful. Additional financial and budget integration, more flexible forecasting groupings, and maybe, if we don't get there, use Dynamics and the Power Platform toolsets to create your own end-to-end solution. This is something we see all the time right now with demand forecasting, especially since Power BI has come such a long way, being able to archive that data out of D365, moving towards this data lake solution now in 2021 to be able to get data in a little bit more realistic real-time scenarios for these large buckets of data that might be very performance intensive. So while it's a great tool, still definitely room for improvement and excited to see where Microsoft is taking this next. So back to planning. One of the issues or one of the first hurdles companies have when they're setting up master planning is knowing what level to coverage plan at. Maybe I have items in multiple warehouses. That doesn't mean that I need to treat every warehouse separately when it comes to planning. If those are logical warehouses or they're just not physical warehouses, we might not want to plan independently for each warehouse and get planned purchase orders and planned production orders for each warehouse. So you can set that up so that you're only planning at the site level. Every item is linked to a storage dimension group, and your storage dimension group has parameters that say coverage plan by. Coverage plan by means when we have planned orders, are they linked to that dimension? Is it specifically for that warehouse, or does demand and on-hand inventory in that warehouse not matter, and it's summed up to one level just for the site? Really important when you're setting up your items that way and understanding that. That's going to display in all of your planning forms, planned orders. Net requirements is going to be changed drastically depending on how you set up. So the really first, important decision you have when setting up coverage planning. The next piece is your coverage groups. How should items be grouped together? You very often hear people say, well, group your finished goods, group your WIP, group your raw material, maybe group them by items that have a similar lead time. That is one part of it, but understanding some of the additional parameters for your coverage groups might make you react or change the setup a little bit differently. Coverage groups have different types. There's a requirement-based coverage group. You can kind of think of that as the one-to-one. I get one demand, I get one supply to match it. Other things obviously come into play with different parameters we have, positive and negative days and such, but that's kind of the simplest way to describe it, requirement-based. We then have period-based, probably something I see used most commonly now to help us eliminate a lot of unnecessary reviewing of data, especially when it comes to purchasing. If I have raw materials that are shared, I don't want to get a planned order to purchase every single unit of raw material every time there's demand. I'm most likely buying that in bulk. I'm most likely buying that over a lead time. Maybe I have standard order quantities with my vendors. So a coverage group of period-based is going to sum all of the demand over a given time bucket into one planned order. So I might have 10 different production orders out there, all requiring the same raw material, and they all need them in quantities of 10. I don't want 10 planned orders of 10. I want one planned order of 100. You also have min-max you can set up there if you want a maybe more common approach to reorder points or safety stock, where once a minimum threshold is exceeded, we want a planned order to get our inventory back to the maximum level of inventory. One common, I guess, question or one common error people make is they think that maximum setting actually prevents inventory from ever going over that level. That's not true. The maximum level is really just used as your kind of reorder point scenario or your ideal stocking level. It will not prevent you from managing inventory over that stocking limit. So setting up your coverage groups, make sure you talk to the supply chain, make sure your time fences cover what they need to. Usually I'll recommend it should be a lead time plus at least 20% to make sure that you can react to demand and supply fluctuation. Some people just put it at the lead time and then issues happen and you can't react because all of a sudden an urgent order drops in and your time fence wasn't long enough to cover it. Previously, I would also recommend don't just set all your time fences to 365 days. Then you're looking at a bunch of orders that aren't urgent, that don't matter, that are likely to change. And also in the past, that was really impacting your performance. If you were scheduling 365 days when an item had 90 days lead time, that was leading to a lot of unnecessary reviewing of data. With planning optimization, that's no longer really a concern, but other reasons to not just fully set out your time fences past realistic due dates. Min-max keys is another thing to look at. If you have seasonality, you can use min-max keys with your safety stock levels. And then one final quick note on this slide is positive and negative days. This comes up in almost every master planning session, demo, slide deck you'll see out there. And you often strong on what your positive and negative days should be. For me, talk to your planners. A lot of people don't want to go through the efforts of learning all the tools available in Dynamics 365, understanding action messages, understanding calculated delays, which used to have a different name in AX 2012 and 2009. But those tools are there to tell you have options. So positive and negative days are there to tell you what inventory you should consider. Negative days are really saying if supply is going to be late, is it still valid to meet my demand if the quantity matches? Well, if my production is going to be a week late to meet a sales order, a new production order isn't going to go any quicker. So having a negative days that allows a new production order to be created purely to tell my planner that they need to do something isn't always the best tool. If they're getting an action that just says, hey, production should be done sooner, or we need to push this sales order out with a calculated delay, that should be enough. So try not to use negative days just because it's easier for someone to see a planned order versus a message. Use negative days so you're eliminating the amount of planned orders they have to review, and you're not forcing extra orders to accidentally be placed, and then you lead to overstock scenarios or wasted money because you're buying or making something that you didn't need to, when truly the real issue was lead time or capacity. This is another screenshot around some of those tips and tricks on coverage planning, eliminating maybe some of the one-offs. You can group orders by vendor. You can group orders by buyer group. So when I firm multiple planned orders at one time, they consolidate into single planned orders. That can also be driven by date as well. So make sure you're looking at those parameters. They can be put in by default, and the planner can also do that as they're firming orders. They can select those checkboxes manually if you do have exceptions. Next, supply schedules. This is the one I said is kind of like the hidden gem. Supply schedules are really powerful forms. not only can you see a lot of data, but you can get to almost any form you need to in master planning. What I'm showing here is essentially how I can manipulate calendars in the supply schedule. So I can have different periods. Maybe first I want to look at them in monthly buckets. Then I want to see some sort of hybrid approach. The next 4 weeks are weekly. The next 4 months after that are monthly. Everything else is just sum total for the year. We can see beginning and end balances for inventory, supply, and demand. We can see broken out what types of demand for this item or this item family. Well, there's 3,900 sales orders. There's 1,700 planned intercompany demand. There's 2 return purchase orders. There's 20 transfers, 10 inventory. This form can give you a lot of information about single items and item families. It can be run at any point. As you can see, you can navigate to a master planning run. You can pull up max report as finished information. You can edit planned orders from here. You can show delays from here. You can have Kanban information from here. So a really, truly powerful form, supply schedules. I won't spend too much time. I'll do a little bit of a shameless plug. I wrote extensively about the supply schedule in my blog at WordPress Dynamics Unplugged, where you can view how to set it up, how to use it. It has graphs that are great for looking at beginning and ending balances over different periods of time. And you can see you can even create new supply from here. I can create a forecast. I can create a planned order, production order, purchase order, and transfer order, all from the supply schedule form. Okay, so we got about 15 minutes left. We're starting to now get into tying the supply chain into what sales do, what customer service does. We've talked about forecasts. We've talked about ways of managing stock, but what do we actually tell our customers, and how do we come up with dates so that when we're putting orders into the system, those are feeding back to the supply chain how they need to, and production can react to them, and purchasing can react to them, and sales themselves can react to them. So we have what's called delivery day control in Dynamics. This considers a bunch of different calendars that are set up in the system. Those could be customer-specific calendars if they only accept deliveries on certain days. These can be your master plan and coverage group calendars, resource group and resource calendars for production, and transport calendars for modes of delivery with our carriers. So the delivery date is determined with those calendars and based on the delivery day control option. The simplest option is none. All ship and receipt dates on the transfer order and sales order are entered manually. If I create a new sales order line, the date is going to default to today's date, and I have to manipulate it. As you guys well know, there are ship and receipt dates, the date it leaves your warehouse, the date it's expected at the customer. Those would both default to the same date. Everything would be managed manually if you use none as a delivery day control option. Sales lead time is a very common approach. If you think of like a catalog company or off the shelf, X number of days, a predefined sales lead time for a product or a group of products. It doesn't matter what's showing in stock. It's not considering what's in stock. It's not considering backlogs. It is a quoted lead time. So when I place an order, it is X days from current date. That can be applied for all items for a legal entity. It can also be applied at the individual item or the item and variant level as well in your default order settings or your item coverage. Next, we get into the calculated methods. How can we really, truly, powerfully use the system to help us calculate more accurate delivery dates? First is available to promise. An item or a quantity of an item is considered available and can be promised to a customer on a specific date if that inventory is uncommitted. So what does that mean? Well, match supply and demand, right? If I look at today's date, I have 10 on hand, I have no demand for that 10, and I have supply coming in 2 more later today, I can promise those 12 pieces for any orders that come in. As more orders come in, whether they be purchase orders, transfer orders, production orders, or sales orders, it's going to continue to match that supply and demand until any demand can no longer be reached. And then it's going to give me that available to promise date. So if the quantity is available, that's my ATP date. If it's not, the ATP date is the date it should be available. You also have a time fence on this because you don't want it to consider infinity. If the ATP calculation runs and you have a time fence of 30 days and it can not find a day where it expects to have inventory available for the sales order, it will push out your sales date to the end of the time fence. So maybe 30 days is the longest you'll ever quote a customer. You would set that as your ATP date. ATP plus issue margin adds a little bit of a safety factor. Maybe we have not within the lead time, but an issue margin for warehouse activities that add an extra day to the lead time. Maybe that's packaging, health and safety type related activities that we don't have factored into the actual lead time, but it can be factored into our delivery date promising. And then finally, capable to promise, used in the make to order and engineer to order scenarios. Availability is calculated through a bill of material explosion. It's looking at what inventory you have on hand. It's looking at lead times and routes of items you don't have on hand, and it's coming up with the expected date of when you can realistically make that buy. And it's setting your ship date and your receipt date on sales orders. So these last 4 options really all automatically set the delivery date on your orders, and master planning will then use those dates as the expected date it needs to calculate off of when it's calculating dates for production and purchasing and so on. This form here is the sales order form showing you where you can simulate those delivery dates. Even if your company chooses not to automatically set delivery dates based on those options, you can still run an ATP calculation from sales orders to figure out what that would be. So a lot of times if you're newer, you don't want to run right into ATP, right into CTP, start off maybe a little more simple. You can use something like a sales lead time or a none, and then have your order entry people simulate the delivery dates to see how accurate those might be, or to guide them in setting a suggested delivery date. And then one of the last things I'd like to talk about is one of the newest and biggest changes we'll see in the supply chain this year. So planning optimization. As we all know, Microsoft, or master planning in Dynamics, I should say, has always been one of the most labor-intensive processes. You always had to run it at night because it ran on the server. It slowed down user processing. They were hitting the same tables. It was hitting sales orders. It was hitting production orders as those users were trying to create records in the same tables and causing a lot of locks. So this is now moved outside to an add-in service, and the built-in planning engine will be made obsolete. This change will affect all cloud environments. On-premise installations are not affected. And then in version 10.16 or later, you'll receive an error message if you try to run that built-in master planning without generating planned production orders. It would still run. So it's kind of been rolled out in phases. It started with the planned purchasing and planned transfers, things like that. Then we're moving into the more complicated planned production scenarios to be brought into the planning optimization tool. If you are just deploying D365 or just kicking off your project, planning optimization is recommended to be considered the planning engine for all new deployments in the cloud. So work with your partner to talk about the impacts of that, to talk about if it's the right fit. If you're in production, you have a little bit more leeway into using the standard existing planning engine that's there now, and can request an exception from Microsoft for that. But if not, then this would be the process you would want to use. Microsoft posted a lot of good information about this. It is an add-in that sits outside of D365 SEM and Azure SQL Database on a service. What we've seen is that master planning runs that used to be hours are now minutes, and ones that were minutes can now be seconds. There's some good use cases out there that Microsoft have published. TwillFit, for example, has a really good Microsoft story about using the planning optimization service and the improvements and impact they've seen to their business. Mostly people look at this as a huge technical benefit and performance improvement, but it can really change your business now that you're able to run scenario planning in real time, that you're able to see the impact of huge demand and supply changes as they come into the system, and can run multiple plans with different parameters right then and there and look at the impact to production and to your vendors and to your dollars, essentially. So planning optimization, not to be really looked at just as a technical tool, but as something that could really transform your supply chain entirely. Last little piece here, along with supply chain, I've talked a lot about Power BI. We at Arbella have been working on one of our IP projects, one of our main tools called Arbella Data Insights with Power BI. We have full sets of historical data report from pre-built KPIs. We talk about a lot of the things and have charts for a lot of things I talked about today, like demand forecasting, like warehouse management, ABC analysis, financial projections, project module, and so on. So to recap, while I open it up for questions here in the last few minutes, set up an S&OP strategy and have one. Align it with all of your supply chain, not just sales, not just procurement, production, everybody. Know your inputs and outputs to the master plan. Review your data and look for the new tools. As we've seen, planning optimization has come out. Then demand forecasting continues to get new functionality. One we didn't even talk about today around planning in general is visual Gantt chart scheduling. I did a blog on this, and there's a great video of this by Lachlan Cash from Microsoft talking about what that offers, giving a visual drag and drop tool rather than just working in a grid form. So functionality always being introduced into the supply chain. Dynamics really becoming a leader in this space. Definitely keep a lookout for what Microsoft will be bringing in here in the new year. So with that, I will open up for some questions.
Thank you, Andrew. So we have a few questions. The first question is from Edward. How do we deal with substituted products when calculating demand? Are these combined?
Right. So great question. Substitution is not supported out of the box. You do kind of have to get creative with doing that if you're not using an ISV or add-on module. In the past, what we have done is leverage the historical external demand staging table and loaded the substitution items forecast against the new item to support new forecast generation. That is a lot of heavy lifting because pretty much every time you reforecast, you have to reload that data month after month. So it's not a great method. It's very manual, but unless you're building a customization or looking at a third-party tool, there's no way to support that out of the box. It's a pretty manual effort.
Okay. There are a couple of questions from Irtifa. But the first one is how effectively master planning runs with project management and accounting. What are the limitations?
Master planning supports the project management module, so you can get planned item requirements, demand project. You can run forecasts directly from projects and have those calculated in your master plan. So when setting up your master plan itself, there's some parameters that dictate what you want to take into account from a projects module point of view.
There is another question from Irtifa. So we can plan at site level. Can we also run the master planning at site level to generate plan orders for a specific site? Similarly, can I run the master planning for my critical stocks only?
Okay, so I'll kind of take that, I guess, I'll split it up almost into two questions. So first, you can plan just at the site level. If you don't set coverage planning at the warehouse level, then it will plan just to the site. For critical items, that would be probably how you need to set up your master plan. So you can run filters to only run master plans for certain sets of data. And then there's also some new parameters against master plans to exclude things like if there's no demand or no on-hand inventory. In the past, master planning used to look at everything regardless of if there was changes in supply and demand or even if there was transactions that should trigger master planning. There are some pre and post-processing flags now that you can set on the plans to exclude those. And as I said, you can also put in filters to only run master planning on certain items or levels rather than run it for everything.
All right, that's all we have for questions. If you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to Andrew. He has provided his contact. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, everyone.